There was a moment in comic book culture when continuity still felt sacred, not because readers truly understood it, but because they believed the structure itself meant something. Universes expanded slowly. Heroes aged symbolically instead of literally. Moral lines remained visible from a distance. Superman stood at the center of the skyline like a fixed star, less a character than a stabilizing force holding the architecture of the medium together. Even conflict operated under invisible rules. Stories could become darker, stranger, more violent, but somewhere underneath the spectacle, there was still the assumption that the universe knew what it was. Then the walls started moving. By the late 20th century, superhero fiction had stopped behaving like mythology and started behaving like an unstable empire trying to survive its own expansion. Crisis events rewrote timelines. Dead characters returned. Heroes fractured into alternate versions of themselves. Continuity became less like a foundation and more like disputed territory, constantly occupied, abandoned, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Entire generations of readers grew up watching fiction mutate in real time, not through natural evolution, but through corporate necessity, editorial panic, nostalgia recycling itself into policy. And somewhere inside that collapse sat a boy who remembered what the world used to look like. Not the real world, the older one, the cleaner one, the version that made sense to him. Superboy Prime enters the DC universe, carrying a contradiction that almost immediately transforms him into something far more dangerous than a traditional villain. He is not a monster born from power. He is a reader who became trapped inside the story he loved. A fan who crossed the boundaries separating audience from narrative and discovered that fiction becomes unbearable once it stops reflecting the version of reality that made him feel important. That is what makes him terrifying. Not the strength, not the violence, not even the famous moments where he punches through dimensions or tears heroes apart with his bare hands. Those are symptoms, surface-level ruptures. The real horror of Superboy Prime comes from recognition, because underneath the cosmic destruction sits a psychological structure that feels painfully familiar in modern fandom culture. The conviction that loving something grants ownership over it, the belief that change itself is betrayal, the inability to distinguish between personal disappointment and moral corruption. Prime does not simply dislike what the DC universe became. He experiences transformation as theft. Every tonal shift, every rewritten character, every morally gray storyline feels to him like an attack against his identity. Not because he merely consumed these stories, but because he built himself around them. The fictional universe stopped being entertainment long ago. It became psychological territory, a homeland, a structure holding together his sense of self. And when that structure changed, he interpreted it the same way collapsing nations interpret invasion, as violation. This is why Superboy Prime constantly speaks like someone arguing online, rather than someone living inside a world of real consequences. He treats reality itself like bad writing. Heroes are out of character. Morality has become corrupted. The tone is wrong. The world no longer resembles the version he remembers. In his mind, this is not evolution. It is decay. Somewhere deep beneath the rage exists the conviction that history itself has gone off script. And because he possesses godlike power, he attempts the one thing modern fandom endlessly fantasizes about: correction. That impulse sits at the center of his entire mythology. The need to restore fiction back into alignment with the emotional version preserved inside memory. Not memory as recollection, but memory as ideological territory. Nostalgia hardening into doctrine. Affection becoming entitlement. The past transforming from emotional attachment into moral authority. This is why Prime cannot tolerate irrelevance. Because irrelevance means accepting that the story no longer belongs to him. And modern fandom, despite pretending otherwise, is deeply terrified of exactly that feeling. Entire online communities organize themselves around resistance to narrative change, around preserving identity through preservation of continuity, around treating fictional characters less like evolving myths and more like sacred property. The audience no longer simply watches stories unfold. It surveils them, judges them, attempts to enforce ideological consistency onto fictional worlds that were never designed to remain static forever. Superboy Prime becomes the physical embodiment of that psychological escalation. A fan who literally punches reality for refusing to conform to expectation. But what makes him fascinating is that he is not entirely wrong. That is the uncomfortable truth buried underneath his violence. The universes he criticizes really did become darker. Heroes really did become more fractured, more cynical, more psychologically unstable over time. The innocence he mourns was genuinely replaced by something harsher. Superhero fiction stopped functioning as moral architecture and increasingly became a mirror reflecting cultural exhaustion, institutional distrust, and permanent escalation. Prime sees that transformation clearly. He just cannot survive it emotionally. So instead of adapting, he radicalizes. Every rejection pushes him deeper into the belief that the universe itself is corrupted. Every failed attempt at recognition intensifies the resentment already building inside him. And because his worldview remains emotionally adolescent, he processes contradiction the same way many unstable fandom spaces do, through polarization. Either the old world was correct or the new world is evil. Either he matters or reality is broken. Either the story validates him or the story deserves destruction. There is no middle ground. That rigidity slowly transforms him from observer into invader, from fan into authoritarian. Because once someone begins treating fiction as personal territory, control becomes inevitable. Interpretation becomes conquest. Stories stop existing as living systems and become objects that must be disciplined into ideological obedience. And this is where Superboy Prime stops functioning as merely a comic book character. He becomes diagnostic, a symbolic reflection of what happens when identity fuses too completely with fictional worlds. When people stop engaging with stories as experiences and start treating them as extensions of selfhood. When nostalgia ceases to be memory and becomes a demand that reality remain frozen around emotional comfort. Prime believes he is trying to save the DC universe. But underneath all the speeches about morality and heroism sits a far simpler desire. He wants the story to love him back the way it once did. And when it refuses, he declares war against reality itself. Superboy Prime begins as an impossible collision between audience and mythology. Unlike most superheroes, he does not originate from a world shaped by archetypes, cosmic destiny, or symbolic inevitability. He comes from a place almost identical to the reader's own reality, a world where superheroes exist only as fiction, where comic books occupy grocery store shelves, where Superman belongs to imagination rather than history. That detail matters more than almost anything else in his mythology, because it fundamentally alters the psychological structure of the character before the conflict even begins. Prime does not discover superheroes. He discovers that the fiction he worshipped was real. That distinction changes everything. Most heroes inherit responsibility before identity. Bruce Wayne loses his parents before becoming Batman. Peter Parker fails morally before understanding power. Clark Kent grows up alien before accepting his symbolic role. Their journeys emerge from internal fractures slowly organizing themselves into purpose. But Prime begins from the opposite direction. He already possesses emotional attachment before narrative responsibility arrives. His relationship to Superman is not existential. It is consumptive. He admires him first as a fan. That emotional sequence places him in a psychologically unstable position from the start. Because fandom operates differently than mythology. Mythology invites participation. Fandom invites identification. And identification always carries the risk of possession. Prime's early life reflects that structure with uncomfortable precision. Even before receiving powers, he exists as someone shaped by symbolic inheritance. His very name already burdens him with projection. Clark Kent, a child named after fiction by parents unable to distinguish admiration from identity construction. The gesture appears harmless on the surface, even comedic, but psychologically it establishes the exact dynamic that later destroys him. Prime is born into somebody else's narrative before developing one of his own. He enters life already framed as imitation, already performing proximity to myth instead of individuality. That becomes important later because Prime never fully escapes that condition. Even after gaining powers, even after entering the DC universe itself, he still behaves less like a self-realized hero and more like someone desperately trying to align himself with an existing role. He does not want to discover who he is. He wants confirmation that he belongs inside the stories that shaped him emotionally. And for a brief moment, reality appears to reward that desire. His transformation into Superboy occurs through one of the most absurdly cosmic sequences in DC history, involving dimensional ruptures, Kryptonian origins, and the collision between universes. Yet underneath the spectacle sits a deeply seductive psychological fantasy. The fan discovers he was secretly chosen all along. The reader was never merely observing greatness. He belonged to it from birth. The fantasy is intoxicating because modern fandom quietly revolves around this exact emotional structure. The desire not simply to love fiction, but to inhabit it, to be validated by it, to discover that emotional investment was evidence of deeper belonging rather than passive consumption. Prime's origin literalizes that fantasy with terrifying sincerity, and then the universe immediately punishes him for it. Crisis on Infinite Earths becomes the defining wound of his existence long before it becomes the defining trauma of the DC multiverse. Prime enters the conflict still emotionally innocent, still believing stories operate according to moral architecture. Heroes sacrifice themselves. Goodness matters. Participation creates meaning. Yet despite doing everything correctly, despite fighting alongside legends, despite behaving exactly the way heroic mythology demands, his world is erased anyway. Not conquered, not corrupted, erased. That distinction matters because destruction can produce revenge. Corruption can produce restoration. But erasure creates something psychologically different. A void with nowhere for emotional energy to land. Prime loses not only his home, but the entire symbolic framework validating his existence. His family disappears. His reality disappears. Even his universe becomes narratively inaccessible. History itself moves forward without him. And then comes the true catastrophe, the paradise dimension. On paper it appears merciful. A peaceful existence removed from conflict, shared with alternate versions of Superman and Lois Lane. But psychologically the space functions less like heaven and more like exile. Prime becomes trapped outside narrative relevance itself, forced to observe the continuation of history without participation, watching universes evolve while remaining emotionally frozen inside the moment he lost everything. That environment slowly mutates grief into resentment. Not immediately. That is important. Prime does not emerge from paradise already monstrous. What destroys him is duration. Endless observation without agency. Endless proximity without belonging. He watches the DC universe transform across years of publication history while remaining unable to intervene. New heroes emerge. Old moral structures collapse. Characters become darker, more violent, more psychologically fractured. The symbolic center shifts. Superman himself no longer resembles the version Prime emotionally anchored himself to. And because Prime experiences the universe first as audience rather than inhabitant, He interprets those changes exactly the way fandom culture often does, as deterioration. This is the psychological pivot that defines his entire character. Prime cannot emotionally process fiction as evolving structure because his attachment to it is preservationist rather than adaptive. The DC universe exists in his mind not as living mythology, but as fixed territory. The older version remains morally authoritative simply because it arrived first, because it formed the emotional architecture of his identity during adolescence. That attachment creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion that personal memory grants interpretive superiority. Modern fandom culture constantly reproduces this dynamic. Every generation quietly mistakes emotional proximity for objective understanding. The version encountered during formative years becomes encoded not merely as preference, but as legitimacy itself. Later transformations feel intrusive because they threaten the emotional stability built around earlier narratives. Fiction stops functioning as evolving art and starts functioning as psychological homeland. Prime embodies that escalation completely. When he finally returns during Infinite Crisis, he does not behave like someone re-entering reality. He behaves like an audience member confronting an adaptation that betrayed the source material. Everything appears wrong to him. Superman feels diminished. Heroes compromise morally. Institutions appear unstable. The universe no longer operates according to clean symbolic hierarchies. Good and evil bleed into each other. But the deeper issue is not morality. It is displacement. Prime expected to return home and instead discovered that history had continued without preserving a place for him. The world reorganized itself in his absence. New heroes inherited symbolic territory he still considered emotionally his. Entire generations moved forward while he remained psychologically trapped inside an older framework. That produces humiliation. And humiliation, especially in identity structures built around idealization, almost always transforms into aggression. Connor Kent becomes central here because Connor represents everything Prime cannot tolerate psychologically. He occupies symbolic space Prime believes belongs to him. He possesses recognition, belonging, narrative legitimacy. More importantly, Connor embodies adaptation. He exists comfortably inside the modern DC universe. He accepts ambiguity. He navigates complexity. He survives contradiction. Prime cannot. So their conflict operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Superficially, it appears like rivalry between alternate Superboys. Symbolically, it resembles succession anxiety, an older emotional framework confronting the reality that history no longer revolves around it. Prime does not simply hate Connor because Connor replaced him. He hates him because Connor proves replacement was possible. That realization destabilizes Prime completely because it destroys the illusion that emotional attachment guarantees permanence. The universe moved on. Readers moved on. Even Superman moved on. Prime becomes living evidence that nostalgia alone cannot stop cultural evolution. And this is where his violence begins acquiring ideological dimensions. He starts framing destruction as correction. That rhetorical shift matters because it reveals how resentment reorganizes itself psychologically. Prime cannot admit the true source of his pain because doing so would require confronting irrelevance directly. It would mean acknowledging that his suffering emerges not from universal corruption, but from inability to adapt emotionally to change. Instead, he externalizes the wound. The world becomes flawed. The heroes become fake. Reality itself becomes morally defective. Once that projection solidifies, brutality becomes easier to justify. Because if the universe is genuinely corrupted, then force appears righteous. Prime increasingly speaks less like a person and more like an angry audience segment weaponized into physical form. His dialogue constantly reduces complexity into simplistic binaries. Heroes should behave a certain way. Stories should follow recognizable structures. Morality should remain visually clear. His worldview resembles fandom discourse stripped of irony and amplified through godlike power. And yet underneath the rage remains something painfully adolescent. Need. Need for recognition. Need for validation. Need to matter inside the universe he loves. That is why criticism destabilizes him so completely. Why mockery sends him spiraling into violence. Why being called Superboy instead of Superman feels psychologically catastrophic. The issue is never merely pride. It is symbolic legitimacy. Names determine narrative position. Superman occupies the center of the mythological stage. Superboy remains peripheral, transitional, incomplete. Prime cannot tolerate incompleteness because his identity already feels structurally fragile. Every rejection confirms the same fear, that the story no longer has a place for him. And once someone begins perceiving existence itself through narrative exclusion, escalation becomes almost inevitable. Infinite Crisis does not begin with Superboy Prime trying to destroy the DC universe. That is the mistake people make when looking at the character retroactively, flattening him into a caricature of rage and entitlement without understanding the deeper psychological transition taking place underneath the violence. Prime initially believes he is restoring something, repairing something, correcting a fracture that should never have existed in the first place. That distinction is crucial because it transforms his actions from simple villainy into ideological extremism. He does not see himself as an invader entering foreign territory. He sees himself as the last surviving citizen of the original world. And once someone believes they alone remember the correct version of reality, compromise becomes almost impossible. The DC universe he returns to feels spiritually unfamiliar to him. Heroes argue constantly. Institutions collapse under corruption. Legacy characters inherit symbols without inheriting certainty. Even Superman, the figure anchoring Prime's entire emotional framework, no longer occupies the same mythological position. The old gravitational center has weakened. Moral clarity has fragmented into competing interpretations. Prime experiences that fragmentation as desecration. Not metaphorically, literally. This is where his psychology begins mirroring modern fandom at its most unstable. Many audiences can tolerate change until the transformation reaches identity-level symbols. Once foundational myths begin shifting, emotional discomfort escalates into perceived betrayal. Fiction no longer feels like storytelling. It feels like vandalism against memory itself. Prime embodies that escalation in its purest form because he lacks the emotional distance necessary to separate personal disappointment from objective collapse. The universe changed. Therefore the universe became wrong. That internal logic reorganizes his entire worldview. What makes Infinite Crisis fascinating is that Prime's arguments are not entirely incoherent. The DC universe genuinely had become darker by that point. Cynicism dominated major storylines. Violence increased. Heroes operated under growing moral ambiguity. The symbolic innocence of earlier eras had been replaced by suspicion, trauma, and escalating psychological realism. Prime sees this transformation clearly. He identifies the fracture accurately. He simply cannot process it without radicalization. Because psychologically, Prime still operates through absolutism. Heroes must symbolize certainty. Goodness must remain visible. Superman must function as stable architecture holding the fictional universe together. Once ambiguity enters that structure, Prime interprets it not as maturation but contamination. He cannot emotionally survive a world where ideals evolve because his identity depends entirely on permanence. That rigidity slowly transforms nostalgia into authoritarianism. The shift happens almost invisibly at first. He begins talking less about belonging and more about correction, less about grief and more about judgment. The emotional wound underneath his behavior remains obvious, but the rhetoric surrounding it grows increasingly ideological. The world became weak. Heroes lost their way. Fiction itself requires purification. That language matters, because once people begin framing preference as moral necessity, violence becomes easier to justify psychologically. Prime starts treating continuity the same way zealots treat scripture. Any deviation from the original emotional blueprint becomes evidence of corruption. Complexity becomes weakness. Contradiction becomes heresy. The universe must return to its earlier form, because the earlier form validated him emotionally during the period when his identity first solidified around it. And that creates a terrifying paradox. Prime claims to worship heroism, but he cannot tolerate growth. Real heroism requires adaptation. It requires surviving contradiction without collapsing into resentment. Superman functions symbolically because he evolves while preserving ethical gravity. Prime wants the opposite. He wants preservation without transformation. Mythology frozen into emotional certainty forever. That is not heroism. It is regression disguised as purity. The tragedy is that Prime genuinely cannot see the distinction anymore. This becomes painfully visible in the way he interacts with other heroes throughout Infinite Crisis. Every conversation reveals the same psychological fracture. He constantly demands recognition, while simultaneously attacking the structures capable of granting it. He wants acceptance, but only under conditions where reality reorganizes itself entirely around his expectations. Anything less feels humiliating, and humiliation remains the hidden engine beneath almost all of his violence. Prime does not react to criticism like someone protecting principles. He reacts like someone defending a collapsing self-image. Minor dismissals trigger catastrophic escalation because his identity lacks internal stability. The moment people treat him as secondary, childish, or emotionally unstable, he experiences it as existential confirmation that he does not belong. So he overcompensates through force. This is why his speech patterns matter so much psychologically. Prime never sounds intellectually persuasive. His insults feel emotionally juvenile, almost embarrassingly simplistic. He argues like someone overwhelmed by emotional intensity rather than guided by coherent philosophy. The universe is stupid. Heroes are fake. Everything sucks now. Beneath the cosmic scale, his rhetoric resembles online fandom discourse during emotional meltdown. Because emotionally, that is exactly what it is. Infinite Crisis transforms fandom frustration into physical catastrophe. And nowhere is that more visible than in his relationship with Connor Kent. Connor functions as the symbolic center of Prime's resentment because he embodies successful integration into the modern universe. Connor belongs in ways Prime never learned how to. He possesses relationships, emotional grounding, narrative legitimacy. Most importantly, he does not require the universe to freeze around his expectations in order to survive psychologically. Prime sees all of this immediately, and he interprets it as theft. Not because Connor intentionally replaced him, but because Connor proves replacement was survivable for everyone except Prime himself. The world continued functioning. Superman found new emotional successors. Readers accepted evolving versions of heroism. History reorganized itself around newer symbolic structures. Connor's existence becomes unbearable because it exposes the truth Prime cannot tolerate. The universe was capable of moving on without him. That realization poisons everything. Their eventual confrontation carries far more psychological weight than simple superhero rivalry, because the fight is fundamentally about symbolic legitimacy. Prime does not merely want to defeat Connor physically. He wants to erase the evidence that adaptation succeeded where preservation failed. Connor's continued existence invalidates Prime's entire worldview. So Prime destroys him, and the murder changes something irreversible inside the narrative. Up until that moment, there still exists ambiguity surrounding Prime's motivations. Grief remains visible. Isolation remains understandable. Even his rage carries traces of tragic displacement. But Connor's death exposes the true trajectory of his psychology. He would rather annihilate symbolic territory than accept exclusion from it. That impulse sits at the heart of toxic fandom culture. If the story cannot belong to me, then the story itself deserves destruction. What follows afterward becomes escalation through inevitability. Prime increasingly loses the ability to distinguish between emotional frustration and cosmic authority. Every act of resistance against him reinforces his belief that the universe itself is corrupted. Heroes opposing him become evidence of institutional decay rather than people reacting rationally to mass violence. This creates a closed psychological system. Any rejection confirms the ideology producing the rejection. And because Prime possesses near limitless power, there are very few external structures capable of interrupting that cycle. His physical strength amplifies emotional instability into existential threat. Ordinary fandom resentment remains confined to forums, arguments, endless discourse loops. Prime can literally reshape reality through force. He becomes the fantasy of total interpretive control made flesh. The famous reality punches symbolize far more than spectacle. They represent the ultimate escalation of entitlement culture. The refusal to adapt emotionally becomes so absolute that reality itself must bend instead. Prime cannot negotiate with change because change threatens identity collapse. So he attempts something psychologically impossible. He tries to reverse historical movement itself, restore continuity, reinstate emotional certainty, force mythology back into alignment with memory. But memory was never stable to begin with. That is the hidden contradiction destroying him throughout Infinite Crisis. The older DC universe he worships never truly existed in the pure form preserved inside his mind. Nostalgia edits complexity out of history. It transforms uneven realities into coherent emotional myths. Prime remembers an impossible version of the past because memory itself already functions like revision. So while he accuses the modern universe of corruption, he quietly worships an illusion constructed from selective emotional preservation. And because no real world can survive comparison against idealized memory, disappointment becomes permanent. That permanence is what finally pushes him across the threshold from tragic figure into genuine existential danger. By the climax of Infinite Crisis, Prime no longer seeks belonging. He seeks domination over narrative reality itself. The emotional logic underlying his behavior becomes brutally simple. If the universe refuses to validate him willingly, then validation must be imposed through force. And once that psychological shift occurs, there is no longer any meaningful distinction between saving the story and controlling it. If Infinite Crisis transforms Superboy Prime from displaced fan into ideological extremist, the stories that follow reveal something even more unstable underneath the surface. Emptiness. Not grief anymore. Not even rage in its pure form. Something colder. The psychological collapse that happens when someone finally achieves the confrontation they believed would restore meaning, only to discover the emotional wound survived the victory intact. That is the real aftermath of Infinite Crisis. Prime kills Connor Kent. He battles Superman across collapsing dimensions. He becomes the center of one of the most catastrophic events in DC history. Entire universes fracture around him. And yet once the conflict settles, nothing inside him stabilizes. Recognition still feels temporary. Identity still feels fragile. The universe still refuses to organize itself around his emotional needs. Because resentment cannot actually produce belonging. It can only produce escalation. This is where the character becomes significantly more disturbing psychologically. During Sinestro Corps War and the surrounding stories, Prime gradually loses whatever remained of his earlier innocence and begins replacing emotional vulnerability with performance. Violence stops functioning merely as reaction and becomes spectacle. He starts leaning into the role of existential threat because intimidation finally grants him the visibility he spent years craving unsuccessfully through heroism. The shift resembles something painfully recognizable within modern internet culture. When people feel ignored, they often radicalize visibility itself. Attention becomes identity. Prime begins constructing himself around impact rather than meaning. The more horrifying he becomes, the harder he is to dismiss. Entire armies reorganize themselves around his presence. Heroes panic when he enters the battlefield. Narratives bend around his arrival. He finally achieves the centrality he always believed he deserved, but only through terror, and that creates another contradiction he cannot emotionally process. Prime wants to be Superman, yet the only role he succeeds at inhabiting consistently is catastrophe. Sinestro understands this immediately. That is why recruiting Prime works so effectively despite the obvious instability involved. Sinestro does not offer him healing. He offers him narrative gravity, a throne inside a new symbolic order built entirely around fear, hierarchy, and ideological absolutism. Prime becomes useful because his emotional volatility can now be directed outward toward organized conflict. For perhaps the first time since losing his world, he feels necessary again. That feeling intoxicates him. And yet, even within the Sinestro core, Prime remains psychologically incapable of true allegiance. His hatred toward the Anti-Monitor reveals the deeper fracture still governing his behavior. No matter how destructive he becomes, the original wound continues operating underneath everything else. The universe that erased his home still exists. The force responsible still breathes. Prime's rage keeps circling back toward the same impossible fantasy. Retroactive justice. He wants the past repaired. Not symbolically. Literally. This is where his psychology becomes increasingly trapped inside temporal paralysis. Most characters in superhero fiction orient themselves toward future outcomes. Prime orients himself toward irreversible loss. Every escalation, every alliance, every act of violence quietly revolves around the impossible desire to undo historical movement itself. That is why he feels so emotionally adolescent despite possessing cosmic power. Adolescence often involves the inability to metabolize irreversible transformation. Identity still assumes permanence as possible. The future remains negotiable. Loss feels unfair because the mind has not yet fully accepted that history does not reorganize itself around emotional readiness. Prime remains trapped inside that developmental state indefinitely. He possesses the body of a god and the emotional architecture of someone who never survived grief properly. So instead of integration, he chooses amplification. His battles become increasingly excessive because excess itself functions psychologically as compensation. The more unstable his internal identity becomes, the larger the external demonstrations of power need to grow. Entire universes collapse around his confrontations. Reality distorts under the pressure of his presence. He fights beings operating on near abstract levels of cosmic scale. And still none of it satisfies him, because the real conflict was never external. That becomes brutally visible during Legion of Three Worlds, where Prime finally encounters the thing he fears more than rejection. Insignificance. The future does not remember him the way he imagined. That realization devastates him in ways physical defeat never could. Prime spent years constructing himself around the belief that he was central to the destiny of the DC universe. Even his violence operated under the assumption that history would eventually recognize his importance. Heroes feared him. Universes shattered around him. Entire events reorganized themselves through his actions. Surely that meant permanence. Surely history would remember him as essential. Instead, he discovers confusion, contradiction, narrative incoherence, multiple timelines barely capable of explaining his existence consistently. The future does not frame him as mythological center. It frames him as unstable disruption, a continuity problem. That moment quietly destroys the illusion sustaining him psychologically, because Prime realizes something unbearable. Watching stories does not mean understanding them. Consumption does not create ownership. Emotional investment does not guarantee narrative centrality. He spent years treating himself like the secret protagonist of the DC universe, while the universe itself kept reorganizing around entirely different symbolic structures. The world did not revolve around him after all. And once that illusion collapses, his emotional architecture briefly becomes visible with startling clarity. Underneath the violence sits abandonment. Underneath the entitlement sits loneliness. Underneath the narcissism sits self-hatred. The Blackest Night material exposes this more directly than perhaps any other stage of his development, because the emotional spectrum strips away his defensive narratives one by one. Each color drags another concealed truth to the surface. Jealousy, fear, rage, shame. The symbolic structure works because Prime's psychology has always depended on compartmentalization. He externalizes everything, projects everything outward. The universe is wrong. Heroes are fake. Reality betrayed him. But the emotional spectrum forces inversion. For the first time, the conflict turns inward. And what emerges is not grand ideological conviction, but someone deeply aware of his own inadequacy. Prime admits he never truly wanted superiority. He wanted belonging, recognition, emotional legitimacy. The violence was never about justice. It was about unbearable alienation mutating into resentment after years without emotional grounding. That confession matters because it reframes everything retroactively. Prime does not destroy worlds because he is incapable of feeling. He destroys them because he feels humiliated constantly. And humiliation, especially when fused with power and identity instability, often mutates into cruelty. Modern fandom spaces reproduce this pattern endlessly. People attach themselves so completely to fictional identities that disagreement begins feeling existential. Criticism becomes insult. Narrative change becomes displacement. Other fans become rivals competing for symbolic territory. Entire communities radicalize themselves around the preservation of emotional certainty because uncertainty threatens the fragile identities built around participation. Prime is simply what happens when that psychology acquires cosmic scale. A fandom mindset turned into physical law. What makes him increasingly fascinating throughout this period, however, is that fragments of self-awareness begin appearing despite everything. Small inconsistencies emerge inside his absolutism. Brief moments where the emotional mask slips. He occasionally recognizes the gap between the hero he imagined becoming and the figure he actually transformed into. But recognition alone changes nothing. That is another painful truth embedded throughout his story. Self-awareness without emotional restructuring often just produces despair. Prime understands himself more clearly over time, yet still cannot escape the gravitational pull of the same insecurities. He continues oscillating between grandiosity and collapse, between entitlement and shame, between desperate need for recognition and violent rejection of the people capable of offering it. Because psychologically, he still exists outside ordinary life. And that matters more than the cosmic conflicts. Prime never learned how to live beyond narrative identity. He understands spectacle, conflict, mythology, apocalypse. But ordinary existence remains alien to him. Relationships collapse into projection. Heroism collapses into performance. Even redemption becomes framed like a storyline rather than genuine transformation. He still perceives himself through the lens of fiction first. Always fiction first. That is why he constantly references tropes, narrative structure, continuity logic. He processes reality like commentary rather than lived experience. Death scenes become pacing discussions. Battles become editorial critiques. Emotional events become opportunities for meta-analysis. The audience surrogate aspect of his character keeps resurfacing because psychologically he never fully crossed the threshold into authentic participation. He remains trapped between observer and inhabitant, between reader and character. And people trapped in that space eventually begin losing their ability to distinguish human consequence from symbolic consumption. That disconnect becomes the defining pressure shaping everything that follows. By the time Superboy Prime reaches the later stages of his story, the violence itself almost stops being the most important thing about him. What matters now is the instability, the constant sensation that he exists one emotional rupture away from collapse, even while attempting to become better. That tension transforms him from a relatively straightforward symbol of toxic fandom into something psychologically stranger and more unsettling. Because Prime eventually begins changing. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to expose a far more uncomfortable question underneath the character. What happens when someone built entirely around resentment finally loses the energy required to hate continuously? Most redemption arcs in superhero fiction rely on revelation. A hidden moral core emerges. A traumatic misunderstanding gets corrected. The villain remembers humanity at the last moment. Prime's trajectory refuses that simplicity because his problem was never ignorance. He always understood heroism intellectually. He worshipped it obsessively. The issue was emotional incapacity. He could not survive a universe that refused to center him psychologically. That wound does not disappear. It simply becomes harder for him to weaponize endlessly. Death metal marks the beginning of that transition because for the first time Prime encounters evil stripped of emotional justification. Up until then, he could always rationalize his own extremism through grievance. The universe betrayed him. Heroes failed morally. Reality became corrupted. Every destructive act existed inside a larger narrative where he still imagined himself reacting against decline. But the Batman who laughs represents something different. Pure domination without emotional confusion. There is no nostalgic longing there. No displaced idealism. No wounded attachment to moral architecture. Just appetite. Escalation for its own sake. Destruction detached entirely from grief or identity. Prime cannot psychologically align himself with that kind of force because it exposes the truth about his own behavior too clearly. If he joins absolute nihilism completely, then the fantasy that he was trying to save something collapses permanently. So for perhaps the first time in his existence, he hesitates. That hesitation matters more than any battle, because it reveals that underneath all the rage, some fragment of his original emotional orientation toward heroism survived. Distorted, buried, violent, but not fully erased. Wonder Woman becomes important here precisely because she does not interact with him through humiliation or fear. Most heroes respond to Prime as contamination, as walking catastrophe barely restrained by circumstance. Their reactions reinforce the exact insecurities destabilizing him psychologically. But Wonder Woman approaches him differently. Not sentimentally, not forgivingly, simply without disgust. That distinction creates an opening inside his emotional structure that had almost never existed before. Prime's entire worldview depends on adversarial recognition. People either reject him or fear him. Conflict organizes identity. Opposition confirms existence. But genuine trust, even tentative trust, destabilizes those patterns because it cannot easily be transformed into resentment. Crypto serves a similar symbolic function. The relationship matters because it lacks ideological pressure. No legacy expectations. No continuity debates. No symbolic rivalry. Just uncomplicated attachment. For perhaps the first time since losing his original world, Prime experiences connection without comparison. Nothing needs proving there. Nothing needs defending. And psychologically, That simplicity grounds him in ways cosmic battles never could. What follows is not redemption in the traditional sense. It is exhaustion. Prime slowly begins realizing that resentment itself has become the prison. Years of trying to force reality into alignment with memory accomplished nothing except further isolation. The universe never reverted. History never froze. The emotional satisfaction he imagined waiting beyond total control never arrived. Because nostalgia cannot actually rebuild belonging. It can only endlessly recreate loss. This realization changes the structure of his decision-making. Earlier versions of Prime always acted according to recognition hunger. Even heroism functioned performatively. Sacrifices still revolved around validation. Battles still revolved around proving superiority. But during Death Metal, he finally makes a choice detached from visibility. He sacrifices himself without expectation of acknowledgement. That moment fundamentally reorganizes the character. Not because self-sacrifice automatically erases prior atrocities, but because it represents the first genuinely non-narcissistic action of his entire existence. Prime acts without audience, without applause, without symbolic centrality. The act matters precisely because nobody is supposed to notice it. And psychologically, that is completely new territory for him. For someone whose entire identity depended on being seen, unseen goodness becomes revolutionary. The modern Superman run expands this tension even further by placing Prime in the one environment he never learned how to survive. Ordinary life. That shift initially feels almost absurd. A character associated with universe-shattering violence suddenly confronting jobs, neighborhoods, routines, social integration. Yet symbolically it becomes the most important stage of his development because Prime's core issue was never cosmic-scale morality. It was the inability to exist meaningfully outside spectacle. Without crisis, who is he? Without conflict, what remains? The pocket universe created for him initially appears like fulfillment of his deepest fantasy. Family restored, belonging restored, narrative importance restored. But something subtle has changed. Prime no longer fully trusts the fantasy itself. He understands now that emotional satisfaction cannot emerge purely from narrative correction. Rebuilding the old world exactly as it existed before still would not solve the instability inside him. Because the instability was never truly about continuity. It was about identity dependency. Prime framed himself entirely through fictional structures for so long that he never developed emotional grounding outside them. Reality always functioned like commentary. Other people became supporting cast. Events became plot developments. Even his own suffering became narrativized into grand mythological importance. The newer stories begin forcing him towards something psychologically terrifying. Human-scale existence. Lois Lane telling him to get a job becomes symbolically devastating for exactly that reason. Prime initially cannot comprehend why it matters. From his perspective, ordinary life appears irrelevant compared to cosmic heroism. Why work? Why participate socially? Why exist inside mundane structures when one possesses near-divine power? But that question exposes the flaw that destroyed him from the beginning. He never understood why Superman chose humanity voluntarily. Not performance. Participation. Clark Kent matters because Superman anchors himself through ordinary relationships, responsibilities, limitations, and routines. Humanity is not camouflage. It is grounding structure. Without that grounding, power floats free from consequence. Identity collapses into spectacle. Prime spent years trying to become Superman while rejecting the exact psychological conditions that made Superman stable. The comic store job becomes unexpectedly important because it finally places him inside a social environment not organized around fear, myth, or ideological warfare. He exists among people instead of above them. The symbolism becomes almost painfully obvious. The fan trapped inside fiction now works directly beside the medium that shaped him. But now he must interact with it differently. Not as owner, not as savior, not as persecuted chosen figure, just as participant. And this is where the character becomes genuinely compelling in modern terms because his instability never fully disappears. Prime still processes reality through narrative logic. He still references tropes constantly. He still frames existence like serialized storytelling. Even his attempts at heroism carry traces of performance and insecurity. The volatility remains present beneath the surface. The difference is that he finally recognizes it. That recognition changes the emotional texture of the character entirely. Earlier versions externalized every contradiction. Modern Prime increasingly internalizes conflict instead. When he loses control and kills someone impulsively, the horror no longer comes merely from the violence itself. It comes from the realization that part of him remains psychologically fragmented enough for relapse at any moment. And unlike earlier stories, he cannot fully justify it anymore. That matters enormously, because the inability to rationalize one's own behavior often marks the beginning of actual moral consciousness. Prime slowly loses the protective ideological structures that once converted resentment into certainty. He no longer fully believes the universe deserves correction through force. He no longer fully trusts his own emotional reactions. The black and white worldview governing his earlier existence begins dissolving into ambiguity, which means he finally starts experiencing the thing he spent years rejecting: complexity. That complexity transforms him into something strangely human for the first time. Messy, contradictory, emotionally inconsistent, capable of insight one moment and instability the next. The old absolutism weakens because reality itself keeps refusing to behave according to simplified moral architecture. And perhaps most importantly, Superman himself begins treating Prime differently. Not as contamination, not as failed imitation, but as someone still capable of choice. That trust destabilizes Prime more deeply than punishment ever did because it removes the identity framework sustaining his resentment. If Superman genuinely believes he can become better, then Prime loses the emotional logic allowing him to remain permanently trapped inside grievance. He can no longer define himself exclusively through exclusion. So the conflict shifts inward permanently, not whether the universe deserves saving, whether he knows how to exist inside it without demanding ownership over it first. Superboy Prime stops functioning as a normal comic book villain the moment audiences begin recognizing themselves inside him. That recognition changes the character retroactively. What initially looked like exaggerated satire slowly starts resembling diagnosis. Prime becomes less interesting as an individual and more significant as a cultural pressure point, a symbolic fracture exposing the unstable relationship modern audiences have developed with fiction itself. Because Prime is not merely obsessed with stories, he is psychologically dependent on them, and contemporary fandom culture increasingly operates through the same dependency structure. Superhero mythology once functioned differently within popular culture. Earlier generations engaged with these characters through distance. Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, they existed as cultural myths circulating broadly across society. People loved them deeply, but the relationship remained relatively porous. Stories could shift tones, reinterpret origins, contradict continuity, even disappear temporarily without producing existential crisis among audiences. Modern fandom altered that relationship completely. The rise of digital media transformed participation into permanent immersion. Fans no longer simply consumed stories periodically. They inhabited fictional ecosystems continuously. Forums, social media platforms, reaction channels, power-scaling debates, continuity archives, algorithmic outrage cycles, all of it collapsed the boundary between audience and narrative space. Fiction stopped being something visited temporarily and became an environment people emotionally lived inside every day. That transformation matters enormously for understanding Prime, because he behaves exactly like someone who lost the ability to separate identity from participation. His entire worldview reflects the psychology of permanently online fandom before that phenomenon fully crystallized culturally. He monitors continuity obsessively, treats fictional inconsistency like moral corruption, experiences narrative disappointment as personal injury, frames himself simultaneously as victim, critic, protector, and rightful inheritor of the universe he consumes. In other words, he behaves less like a supervillain and more like fandom itself pushed beyond containment. This is why audiences increasingly gravitated toward him over time instead of rejecting him completely. At first glance, that response seems bizarre. Prime is violent, unstable, narcissistic, emotionally immature. He murders beloved characters over ideological resentment. Yet many readers eventually stopped perceiving him purely as monstrous because the emotional logic underneath his behavior felt familiar. Not acceptable. Familiar. The fear of becoming irrelevant. The attachment to earlier versions of beloved stories. The frustration watching cultural symbols evolve away from formative emotional memories. The suspicion that corporations misunderstand the characters they control. The feeling that newer audiences inherited territory without respecting its original meaning. Modern fandom constantly reproduces these anxieties. Prime simply expresses them without restraint. And because contemporary digital culture increasingly rewards emotional escalation, his psychology accidentally became culturally synchronized with the environments audiences themselves were inhabiting. Online discourse platforms encourage exactly the same behavioral patterns shaping Prime throughout his story. Absolutism, polarization, identity fusion, constant visibility seeking, emotional overinvestment in fictional continuity, performance through outrage. The internet does not merely host fandom anymore. It amplifies it structurally. Every platform rewards reaction intensity because intensity generates engagement. Nuance disappears beneath algorithmic pressure. Emotional moderation receives less visibility than certainty. Gradually, participation itself becomes performative. Loving stories quietly transforms into proving loyalty publicly through increasingly rigid ideological positioning. Prime lives inside that condition permanently. He cannot simply enjoy Superman. He must defend the correct Superman. He cannot merely dislike changes. He must frame them as existential corruption. Fiction becomes battleground rather than experience. Interpretation becomes territorial warfare. That territoriality explains why nostalgia operates so violently inside his psychology. Nostalgia is often misunderstood culturally as harmless affection for the past. But psychologically, nostalgia becomes dangerous once it stops functioning as memory and starts functioning as authority. Prime does not remember the earlier DC universe fondly. He treats it as morally superior by definition. Its emotional impact during his formative years grants it unquestionable legitimacy in his mind. Everything afterward becomes measured against preservation of that emotional state. This mirrors how modern fandom often constructs authenticity. The first version encountered becomes the real version. Earlier emotional attachment hardens into interpretive hierarchy. Entire communities organize themselves around preservation of symbolic purity against perceived contamination by later reinterpretations. The irony, of course, is that superhero mythology has always depended on reinvention to survive historically. Batman exists because the character changed repeatedly across decades. Superman survived precisely because each generation reconfigured him according to new anxieties and cultural pressures. Comic book universes endure through mutation, not preservation. Static mythology dies. Prime cannot emotionally survive that truth, which is why he constantly resembles authoritarian psychology more than heroic psychology. Authoritarian systems always emerge from fear of instability. They promise restoration, clarity, return to purity, simplified moral architecture. Prime speaks exactly this language whenever he condemns the modern DC universe. Heroes lost their way. Morality became compromised. The old world was better. Underneath all of it sits the same fantasy. History reversed into emotional comfort. But fiction cannot remain psychologically alive without contradiction. Mythological systems survive because they absorb cultural tension rather than resisting it entirely. Superman in the Golden Age reflected industrial optimism and immigrant mythology. Later versions absorbed Cold War anxiety, institutional distrust, media fragmentation, postmodern uncertainty. Each transformation altered the symbolic center while preserving enough continuity for recognition to survive. Prime mistakes that evolution for decay because his attachment depends entirely on emotional permanence. That attachment creates another fascinating contradiction within his character. Despite claiming to defend Superman's ideals, Prime consistently violates the deeper symbolic structure, making Superman culturally enduring in the first place. Superman functions mythologically because he adapts compassionately to changing worlds. His stability emerges from ethical orientation, not aesthetic preservation. Prime reduces heroism into aesthetic rigidity instead. The cape must look correct. The morality must remain visually simple. The narrative tone must preserve childhood emotional clarity. He confuses symbolic form with symbolic meaning. And modern fandom often reproduces this exact confusion constantly, obsessing over continuity details, surface-level canon disputes, and aesthetic fidelity, while losing sight of the deeper psychological function mythology serves culturally. That is why Prime's obsession with being recognized matters so much. Recognition represents legitimacy. Legitimacy represents belonging. And belonging represents survival. The more irrelevant he feels, the more violently he attempts to impose himself onto the universe. This dynamic reflects something broader happening culturally inside fandom spaces, shaped by visibility economies. Attention becomes proof of existence. Going unnoticed feels psychologically annihilating. Entire online identities organize themselves around maintaining narrative centrality within communities built around fictional discourse. Prime behaves exactly this way. He escalates constantly because escalation guarantees visibility. Even his redemption arc reflects this tension. The audience fascination surrounding his modern appearances does not emerge purely because he became morally better. It emerges because he became emotionally legible. Readers recognize the instability underneath the rage, the insecurity underneath the arrogance, the loneliness underneath the entitlement, and perhaps most importantly, they recognized how modern media environments help produce people like him psychologically. Permanent immersion inside fictional ecosystems distorts emotional proportion over time. Characters become emotionally real, while actual relationships weaken. Narrative developments begin carrying disproportionate psychic weight because identity has fused too deeply with symbolic consumption. Prime represents the endpoint of that process. A fan who literally cannot distinguish reality from narrative expectation anymore. This becomes especially visible through his constant meta-awareness. Prime processes existence like serialized fiction because he fundamentally understands the universe as audience first, participant second. He predicts tropes, analyzes pacing, references continuity structures during moments of catastrophe. Even death scenes become interpretive exercises rather than emotional experiences. That perspective resembles contemporary media consumption with disturbing accuracy. Modern audiences increasingly experience reality itself through narrative framing. Politics becomes fandom. Celebrity culture becomes mythology. Social media transforms ordinary existence into ongoing performative storytelling. People discuss life through arcs, canon, representation, discourse, endings. The language of fiction colonizes perception itself. Prime simply inhabits that collapse completely. He cannot stop narrativizing existence because he no longer possesses stable identity outside fictional structure. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about him culturally. Not that he loves Superman too much, that he never learned how to exist meaningfully beyond loving Superman. The comic shop job in his later stories becomes symbolically powerful precisely because it gestures toward a possible alternative. Ordinary life, routine participation, human-scale existence detached from cosmic validation. For the first time, Prime begins engaging with fiction without demanding ownership over it absolutely. But even then the instability remains visible, because fandom itself is not inherently destructive. Stories genuinely help people survive emotionally. They shape moral imagination, identity formation, social belonging. Fiction matters profoundly. The danger emerges when symbolic attachment becomes the primary structure holding together selfhood. Once identity depends too heavily on preservation of fictional systems, change begins feeling existential. Prime reveals that threshold with terrifying clarity. He is what happens when mythology stops being guidance and becomes territory, when admiration mutates into possession, when nostalgia hardens into entitlement, when the audience no longer wants stories to evolve, but instead demands that reality itself remain emotionally frozen around the version that once made them feel whole. And in an era where millions of people increasingly organize identity through media consumption, that symbolic warning feels less like satire every year. It feels prophetic. Superboy Prime endures because the conflict inside him never fully resolves. That permanence is what elevates him beyond the status of event villain or continuity anomaly. Most comic book antagonists eventually stabilize into recognizable symbolic roles. Lex Luthor becomes institutional ambition without moral restraint. Joker becomes chaos-consuming structure from within. Darkseid becomes domination elevated into cosmic principle. Their identities crystallize. Their symbolic function remains relatively stable across generations. Prime resists that stability because his mythology is built around instability itself. He represents a psychological condition that modern culture keeps reproducing faster than fiction can contain it. The inability to emotionally metabolize change. The collapse between audience and ownership. The transformation of nostalgia into ideological territory. Every era of fandom generates new versions of the emotional structure living inside him, because the media environment continuously rewards exactly the impulses he embodies. That is why he never truly disappears. Even when stories temporarily remove him from continuity, the symbolic pressure he represents remains active within the culture surrounding superhero fiction itself. Somewhere online, every single day, someone reenacts part of Prime's psychology. Someone interprets adaptation as betrayal. Someone treats disagreement over fictional narratives as existential warfare. Someone mistakes emotional attachment for moral authority. Prime survives because the ecosystem producing him survives. And what makes that legacy especially unsettling is that his fears were not entirely imaginary. Superhero fiction really did become more fragmented over time. Corporate storytelling really did transform mythology into endlessly recyclable intellectual property. Characters really do get reconstructed according to market logic, demographic shifts, editorial trends, and algorithmic visibility pressures. Entire generations genuinely experience grief watching symbolic figures that once grounded them emotionally become altered beyond recognition. Prime identifies those fractures accurately. His tragedy is that he responds to them catastrophically. That distinction prevents the character from collapsing into simple satire. If Prime were merely irrational, he would feel disposable. But he operates from emotional truths distorted into extremism. The world he loved really vanished. The symbolic clarity anchoring earlier superhero eras really fragmented. Fiction increasingly does function through spectacle escalation and continuity instability. Prime simply cannot survive the consequences psychologically. So instead of adapting to transformation, he attempts to dominate it. And domination always becomes self-destructive eventually because reality refuses permanent control. Stories evolve because culture evolves. Audiences change because people change. Mythology survives through reinterpretation, not preservation. Prime spends years trying to imprison narrative movement itself, forcing fiction back into alignment with an emotional state that can never actually return. Because the deeper issue was never continuity. It was time. That is the hidden terror operating underneath his entire character. Prime cannot accept temporality emotionally. He cannot tolerate the idea that stories, worlds, identities, and symbolic structures naturally transform beyond the version that once made him feel emotionally secure. So he keeps trying to stop historical movement through force, as if enough power could reverse psychological displacement itself. But time keeps moving anyway. That realization gradually reshapes the later stages of his character into something unexpectedly tragic. Not tragic because he deserves absolution, but because he slowly begins understanding the thing that destroyed him too late to undo the damage. He finally recognizes that heroism was never about preserving emotional certainty. Superman mattered precisely because he could inhabit changing worlds without demanding ownership over them. Prime wanted the symbol. Clark Kent understood the responsibility. That difference defines the distance between them permanently. And yet the later stories refuse to reduce Prime into pure monstrosity either. That complexity matters. Redemption in his case does not emerge through purification or moral cleansing. It emerges through partial participation, through accepting uncertainty imperfectly, through learning, slowly and inconsistently, how to exist inside reality without requiring constant symbolic centrality. The comic shop becomes one of the most important images in his mythology for exactly this reason. Not because it represents punishment or irony, because it represents scale. Prime spent years operating like a cosmic empire, attempting to conquer narrative territory itself. Entire universes became battlegrounds for his insecurities. Reality fractured around his inability to accept irrelevance. But ordinary life demands something radically different than spectacle. It demands continuity without applause, meaning without constant recognition, identity detached from domination. For perhaps the first time in his existence, Prime begins learning how to occupy space without conquering it. That process remains incomplete, and it probably always should remain incomplete. A fully healed Superboy Prime would lose symbolic relevance almost immediately because the instability is the point. He exists as a reflection of unresolved tensions inside modern media culture itself. Audiences simultaneously crave evolving storytelling and resent transformation. They desire personal identification with fiction while resisting the loss of ownership that deeper participation inevitably creates. They want mythology to feel emotionally permanent within a culture defined entirely by acceleration. Prime lives inside that contradiction permanently, which is why his modern popularity feels so culturally revealing. People do not simply enjoy him because he is powerful or entertaining. They recognize the emotional logic underneath him now. Internet culture normalized many of the psychological patterns he once exaggerated into absurdity. The obsessive continuity debates, the identity-based tribalism, the fixation on canon legitimacy, the transformation of fictional disagreement into moral conflict, the fear of becoming culturally irrelevant as newer generations inherit symbolic territory. Prime stopped looking unrealistic. That shift changes the emotional texture of the character entirely. Earlier readers often perceived him primarily as critique, an intentionally obnoxious embodiment of toxic fandom excess. Contemporary audiences increasingly interpret him with empathy because the conditions producing his psychology became socially ordinary. Not healthy, ordinary. The line separating fandom from identity dissolved culturally. And once that happened, Prime no longer felt alien. He felt familiar. That familiarity creates the final layer of his symbolic legacy. Superboy Prime functions less like warning and more like mirror. He reveals what happens when emotional attachment to fiction expands beyond symbolic participation and becomes existential dependency. When stories stop helping organize identity and instead become the only territory where identity feels stable at all. At that point, any change becomes catastrophic. Any reinterpretation feels invasive. Any displacement feels annihilating. And because modern media environments encourage endless immersion, many people increasingly live close to that threshold psychologically without realizing it. Fiction offers comfort, certainty, belonging, symbolic coherence. But when those structures become primary replacements for emotional grounding in ordinary life, instability follows inevitably. The person begins treating narrative preservation as self-preservation. Prime crossed that threshold completely. That is why he keeps trying to punch reality itself into submission. Because emotionally, reality betrayed him first. The final irony is that the DC universe ultimately survives not by defeating Prime physically, but by refusing to validate his worldview entirely. Continuity keeps evolving. Heroes keep changing. New audiences keep inheriting the mythology. The universe remains unstable, contradictory, fragmented, alive. Exactly the condition Prime spent his entire existence trying to correct. And yet Superman endures anyway. Not because the stories remained pure, because the symbol proved flexible enough to survive transformation. Prime never fully understood that adaptability was the real source of Superman's strength. Not invulnerability, not moral perfection, not nostalgia. The ability to move through history without demanding that history stop moving in return. That is the lesson he spends his entire life resisting. And perhaps the reason he remains so compelling is because modern culture still struggles to accept it too. Superboy Prime stands at the edge of superhero mythology like a permanent fracture in the wall, staring directly at the audience that created him, not asking whether fiction matters too much. Everyone already knows it does. The real question is more uncomfortable. What happens when people can no longer survive emotionally without the stories remaining exactly the same forever?